Good morning, everyone. Welcome back after a month, and we are really happy to kick off with today's session. So, as a lot of you know, we took a break for a month for some internal administrative work, but we're really happy to be back. And our first session today is on India's military priorities for force modernization. We have General Ahuja joining us and Captain Parmar, who will be the speakers, and Dr. Reshmi Kazi will be the moderator. Before I give it to Dr. Kazi, just a brief about Asian Pathfinders. So we started, like I said, I'm the worst person when it comes to technology. So yeah, we are a knowledge sharing platform. We started in 2020. The aim is to have these constructive dialogues and discussions on a variety of topics. This month we have on India's defense sector. Earlier we've had discussions on India's internal security. We've had on cyber security, non-traditional security threats, and we've been lucky to have amazing speakers and moderators as well as participants who join us from all over the world and contribute to these discussions. So we're really thankful to everyone. And we are always an informal forum. We always welcome your ideas and inputs how we can do better. So we hold our fireside chats on Saturdays and the dialogue on the last Thursday of the month. And so, like I said, this month is dedicated to India's defense sector. For the entire month of October, we'll have a lot of sessions dedicated to the various aspects of this topic. The next session is on economics and geopolitics of India's defense procurement. So we have Lieutenant General D.S. Huda and Mr. Amit Koshish joining us. And I know that our moderator for next week, Oishi Kundu, is also already on this session. So thanks, Oishi. So we're going to have an amazing session next week also. So do join us. I know Shreyas will put in the link in the chat section if you would like to register for that. So the guidelines, like I said, we all come from different walks of life, so we have our views. So we don't restrict you from expressing the views, but we also say, please respect the views. So let's have these discussions in a more constructive way, respect the intellectual property, and please do not post any defamatory, abusive content. Stress, or I'll have to remove you. So Shreyas and I are the co-founders, and you can reach me, him, or Asian Pathfinders on these IDs. And so today's session, we have Dr. Reshmi Kazi, who will be the moderator. I know Reshmi will introduce the speakers, so I'll take the pleasure to introduce her. She's associate professor at the Jamia Millia Islamia Central University, based in Delhi. She specializes in nuclear security, nuclear non-proliferation, and nuclear disarmament. She was associate fellow at IDSA New Delhi, and she has also extensively written on nuclear security issues and made several presentations. Her latest publication includes co-edited volume on India and global nuclear governance, published by Routledge, and post-nuclear security summit process, continuing challenges and emerging prospects and and nuclear terrorism, the new terror of the 21st century. She's an alumni of the National Defense University's Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Study, Washington, D.C., and a visiting fellow for summer 2016 for the South Asia program in the I'm really bad today. Stimson Center, Washington, D.C. And over to you, Reshmi. I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Pallavi, for those kind words. You have been in touch with me over the past few days. Sorry for not being able to respond to you sometimes on time, but thank you so much for having me here. Shreyas, a very, very big thank you to you also. We have been colleagues in IDSA, so there's nothing formal. But again, thank you so much for having me here. And of course, Asian Pathfinders, this is such a beautiful and I must say a very, very upcoming and a bright platform as I see. So many things are being discussed here. Platform is being, we have this platform where we can discuss important issues like the one that we are going to be discussing today. So thank you so much, Asian Pathfinders, for having me again here. And I will not be, it will not be a complete, I'm not trying to make any kind of Oscar speech out here, but then it will be, it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Lieutenant General Anil Ahuja, a very distinguished person in his own, capacity. And Captain Parmar, I mean, needless to say, I don't have enough words, but thank you so much for sharing the platform with me, and it's a great pleasure to like introduce you to. Lieutenant General Anil Ahuja and Captain Parmar, your CV is so impressive and so long. I'm sure, I mean, introducing you would take more than just a session. But then very quickly, as per the formalities, Lieutenant General Anil Ahuja, PBSM, UYSM, AVSM, SM, VSM, and BAR. He has served in the Indian Army for 39 long years and superannuated as the Deputy Chief of Integrated Defense Staff, Policy Planning and Force Development in August 2016. During his distinguished military career, he commanded an operational corps and a mountain division along the northern borders in Arunachal Pradesh and Assam. He also commanded a brigade in counter-insurgency operations. He has been India's defense attaché to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. PDR between 2002 and 2005. And of course, in UN military observer in Angola from 1991 to 1993. I can go on and on. And so what a great pleasure to introduce you, Lieutenant General Anil Ahuja. Captain Parmar, he's an alumni of the National Defense Academy and Defense Services Staff College, Wellington. Captain Parmar, he was commissioned into the Indian Navy, on 1st July 87. He's a Sea King pilot who has commanded 2 ships and a frontline Sea King squadron. He was a member of the 11 Indian Antarctic Summer Expedition in 1991. And he has attended the South Asia Regional Governance and Management Defense course conducted by the British government at Colombo in 2005. He also represented the Indian Army in the first international HOSTAC, that is helicopter operations from ships and other than aircraft carriers conference. This was held in Norfolk, USA in 2008. It was a pleasure being his colleague. He was a research fellow in the IDSA, and what a great, personality. I shared so many inputs with him while in IDSA. Working with him was such a pleasure. He has written extensively on maritime security aspects and presented papers at various national and international conferences. I was myself a participant in some of the, presentations he made, and I learned a lot from him. Thank you so much, Captain Parmar. We have a very limited time period in this session, so I will quickly, flag off the issue. We will be talking on a very important aspect today, that is India's military priorities for force modernization, which occupies a very important aspect so far as our defense preparedness is concerned. And given the kind of contemporary situations that is ongoing, particularly the recent standoff with China, it does we are not that we were sitting tight or we are sitting ducks, but there is a renewed and reinvigorated attention and focus, I believe, which I guess this today's event is also contribute on this issue. Now, understandably, when we're talking about force modernization, and I come from Nelson Mandela, though I have hardcore, strategic background from IDSA, but given my stint in Jamia from the Nelson Mandela Peace and Conflict Resolution, I also understand the importance of peace. But then, peace cannot also exist in vacuum, given the kind of situation that we are, going through. But all the same, one of the most, as we understand, there's a remarkable attribute of India, particularly when we are talking about military issues, is the restraint that we have maintained in our military strategy. And I understand that reticence is an important aspect when we are talking about the use of force. But it is also a stark reality that an adequate and appropriate defense allocation is important. It's important. It's necessary, to achieve mega procurement plans, which is very much part of the military modernization issues. And we know that because of the defense, the budget allocation, the problems that are associated with it, there are, mega procurement plans that have either been stalled or even, for that matter, slowed down. And there is a lot of anxiety over that. The ongoing border issues with China, it has raised the need for further defense modernization, and a lot of, there are hiccups regarding stalled defense procurement plans, mega deals regarding transport and fighter aircrafts, helicopters, other kind of, ammunitions and weapons like artillery, guns, assault rifles, snipers, specialized vehicles. The kind of modernization that is going on, in terms of, in view of the fact that China it has gradually, over the period of time, it has graduated from a manpower intensive force to a capital intensive, force now. And given these requirements, it's important that, we have our defense preparedness, the defense modernization, defense procurement all in place. So with that background, I mean, it's important. There are certain questions that definitely comes to my mind, that in the light of the increasingly assertive China and the shifting role of the US on the global geopolitical stage, how do we see India's military priorities evolving? How do we also view the changing procurement sources of India, given the the resource crunches that there, given the modest defense allocation, that is also the defense budget that we have in the recent times? How do we align our military priorities with that? Also, to what extent does India's defense establishment take the domestic sector, the domestic defense industry into its ambit when we are designing our military priorities? So these are some of the important, questions that, they come to my mind at this stage. But I'm sure the speakers will, highlight on them, and we will get to learn a lot of, from their wisdom, from their inputs. So I would hand over to Lieutenant General Ahuja. Please, this is all yours. We have 10 to 12 minutes for each of these speakers, and then over to the question answer session, please. Lieutenant General Ahuja, all yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Pallavi, and thank you, Shreyas, for inviting me for this chat with Asian Pathfinders. This is the first time I'm getting associated with you all. Look forward to our continued association. And thank you, Dr. Reshmi, for the very kind introduction. And it's a pleasure being with you and with Captain Sarabjit for this discussion. Well, the topic for our discussion that you have amplified so well is India's military priorities for force modernization. Now, in your introductory remarks, you've laid down a wide scope. I'm not sure whether I'll be able to cover many of these things during the time that is allotted, but one would be happy to take whatever is left over, would be happy to take on during the Q&A session. Now, we understand that force modernization entails change or upgrade of weapons and equipment to meet the security challenges that we have for meeting our objectives. Now, although it's a military related topic per se, but I'm delighted that we have with us a mixed audience from diverse backgrounds. And I quite understand that this topic evokes different interest in different people. For those from defense and from industry, it'll give them idea of the likely future inductions for which they need to prepare themselves. To innovators, scientists, it'll give a perspective of the field of research and the technology gaps that we need to bridge. And to others, it'll give a sense of our defense preparedness. You mentioned about the Chinese threat, you mentioned about the Pakistan threat. It'll give you an idea of what is a state of defense preparedness for the nation, and it'll help you to form your opinion of how our armed forces are placed with respect to our neighbors and to play a regional role. A realistic idea of what we can do and what we cannot do. And it will be my endeavor to address the interests of different audience that we have. Now, at the very outset, let me be very honest to admit that neither me nor anybody has a ready-made master list of India's priorities for military modernization. Yes, we don't have this list because these priorities are dynamic and they keep evolving. And any priority list that I may share based on the DAC approvals that have been given, the Defense Acquisition Council approvals, like what you read in the newspapers after every Defense Acquisition Council meeting, even if I list out the main battle tanks and the LCAs and the UAVs and the multi-role helicopters, etc., etc. One, they will not give you an understanding of the method behind this prioritization exercise. And two, the list would be outdated tomorrow morning because the priorities will change. So what I'll do is I'll endeavor to explain the nuances of determining the priorities for military modernization so that you can figure out the rationale and the complexity behind it. And in the time that is available, let me touch upon three things. Number one, the factors impacting military modernization priorities. Number two, let me touch on the dilemma of military prioritization for defense planners, because in the opening remarks, Dr. Kazi mentioned about the constrained budgets that we have and the changing priorities that we have. So what are the dilemmas that any defense planner faces? And finally, let me give some suggested priorities from my perspective. I have no inside information, but from whatever my experience is. So a word about the factors. To my mind, there are 5-6 factors which impact the prioritization of our military. I will not dwell on these. These are self-explanatory. Should you want any amplification, I'll be happy to take it on during the Q&A session. One, our modernization is impacted by the threat perception that we have and the prevailing security environment. What we have going on the high altitudes and the mountainous LC and the LAC, what's happening in the maritime domain, what's happening in cyber, what's happening in space, all these determine what is my priority for force modernization. The second is the national security objective. What do I want to do? Am I looking at only maintaining my territorial integrity and my sovereignty? Am I looking at playing a regional role? What am I looking at? Now, these security objectives will determine what we get and in what priority do we get. The next factor is our war fighting doctrine. How does the nation choose to fight? Do I want to fight conventional war with conventional forces? Do I want to fight using non-state actors like what Pakistan is doing? Do I want to fight primarily in the asymmetric domains, in cyber, in space? Do I want to fight in a nuclear domain with the nuclear deterrence? So what is the war fighting doctrine? How does the country want to fight? And it is based on these that I'll allocate the priorities of my acquisition and my force modernization. The fourth aspect is advancements in defense technologies. There was a time when we joined service, getting night sights for the tanks and making the armor night enabled used to be a big advancement in defense technology. We got anti-tank weapons to counter the tanks. And today you fast forward it, we are looking at the drones doing a tremendous amount of contribution in fighting. We are looking at prioritizing anti-drone measures. We are looking at UCAVs, etc., etc. So what is available to fight and what is available to counter those weapons will impact what priority do I have for modernization. Next aspect is of financial resources that are available. I may want moon, but that's what I have in my pocket. And as I see in the next session that is slotted for next Saturday, this aspect will get covered in substantial details. And finally, the next factor is of national policy or on strategic partnerships and alliances. I mean, conceptually, we are not getting into any alliance. We are getting into partnerships. What is the extent of partnership? What's the depth of that partnership? And within that partnership, what is it that I can rely on my partner, where I may not have to spend enough to build my own capability? Just to illustrate, Japan, South Korea, they are not spending anything for their nuclear development because they are relying on the US nuclear umbrella. So today, if I can get some satellite imagery, if I can get some intelligence, reliable intelligence from Americans, well, perhaps I may have the luxury of postponing that acquisition for some time. And there can be many of these. So what do I think about partnerships? How much of weight do I give to them will determine what I need to bring or develop my own capabilities. Now, so this was, I had briefly touched on a few of these factors. Now let me come to the second aspect of what is a defense planner's dilemma. One has had the opportunity of being part of the Defense Acquisition Council during the service. And today, in the absence of a well-enunciated national defense strategy, some of the specific dilemmas that we in India have in deciding our priorities for an integrated force modernization are: where should we lay our emphasis? Should we lay it in the continental domain or in the maritime domain or in the emerging domains of cyberspace, etc., etc.? Should our priority be safeguarding the territorial integrity along the LC and LAC with Pakistan and China? Or should we focus on safeguarding our sea lanes of communication, our trade and energy lifeline, and to play the regional role expected of us, which primarily become maritime centric? The next dilemma is that, okay, if we decide to go into maritime domain, how do we inter se prioritize acquiring aircraft carriers, surface ships, submarines, anti-submarine warfare capabilities, or unmanned systems? Do we develop aircraft carriers or do we develop our island territories as unsinkable aircraft carriers? If the priority is on land, do we develop our capability for the plains and for the deserts with main battle tank self-propelled guns, or for the mountains with super high altitude equipment, ultralight howitzers, mountain warfare systems, etc.? The next dilemma is, do we hold our borders strongly with troops deployed ab initio in their defenses as we have against China, or do we enhance mobility by giving them helicopters, giving inter-valley mobility? So how do we do it? How do we respond to the terrorist threat from across the border? By having strongly fenced LC with the defenses over them, or do we get into Uri type land-based response, or do we get into Balakot type air-based response? To hit the terrorist infrastructure across, do we use unmanned aircraft? Do we use manned aircraft as we did? Do we use rockets and missiles? And how do we balance our capability between Army, Navy, Air Force, cyberspace, etc., etc. Now, these are the dilemmas. And when people accuse the armed forces of aiming without arming, it is because we don't have a clear answer to the factors that I described, and we don't have a clear-cut answer to the questions through the dilemmas that I've raised. And finally, before I conclude, let me just give out a few modernization priorities from my perspective. One, in the prevailing environment, I personally would recommend prioritizing capability development and modernization on land, followed by maritime domain. It's not either or, it's both. As our economy grows and boundaries get settled, we'll need to start shifting focus on building stronger maritime capabilities. And I know what I say is contrary to what the American and the Western authors have been writing, or perhaps my co-panelist, Sarabjit, himself would believe. Well, they would call it a continental strategy trap. That's my view. And I'm willing to accept a different view. The next is in building. I know the building maritime capability is time consuming. We require long gestation period, so we need to start now. Developing air capability is necessary to complement both land and air domain. Alongside, we need to develop our special forces. Thereafter, in the asymmetric domain, my recommended priorities would be cyber, followed by space, followed by nuclear and information warfare. In these, we need to develop both defensive as well as offensive capabilities. The biggest operational void that we have is in our ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, and the domain awareness capabilities. We were surprised in Kargil. Initially, we were surprised in Ladakh. We are doing better. We've started building our capabilities, but we need to do much more to build our eyes and ears. Thereafter, another area of building capabilities is air defense, including defense against drones. Within the land forces, we need to develop high altitude capability because LC and LAC threat manifests there. And next priority is of unarmed and armed UAVs, UCAVs, combat drones with appropriate weapon systems. And thereafter, there are a plethora of things that the Navy requires, which I will leave to Captain Sarabjit. And in conclusion, to my friends from defense industry, if there are any present for the discussion, my suggestion is do not set your priorities for the future based on the negative import lists or the MOD positive import lists that they are indigenization lists as they are called, because they'll be outdated before you get returns for your money. What we need is that the defense forces, DRDO, industry, academia, think tanks, all of us need to put our head together to visualize what is going to be the future battlefield like, and then prepare for it. So that's what I have. I'll be happy to take on questions hereafter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant General Ahuja. Very important points you made there, and particularly the last point that you emphasized upon, that there is some need for cooperation and coordination between the three sectors, the three chiefs, when we are trying to build up our capacities and going for force modernization. Thank you so much. Without any delay, Captain Parmar, all yours now.
Thank you so much, Reshmi. And while I get this going, thank you to Pallavi and Shreyas for inviting me to this. Can you see the screen? If I can get a thumbs up. And General Ahuja, thank you so much, sir. You made my job that much more easier, that I think we can do a joint approach in this aspect is something that the three services need to look at. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through some ideas which I've had for some time and which I've shared earlier at different fora. So first of all, let's look at the world as we see it, say, from India. Now, this is a snapshot from the Indian Maritime Security Strategy document of 2015. I was actually sort of when IDSA asked for my second retention, I was called back essentially to revise this document. So this is the world as we see it. Although it's more of a maritime one, it shows us the importance of what we look at within the region and outside the region. So this dark blue area, if you follow the cursor, is what we had identified as the primary area of maritime interest. But it's not only maritime. There are a lot of land-based and air-based factors that come into this issue, especially in this area. And the light blue area out here is what we had called a secondary area of maritime interest. And then, of course, this was before Indo-Pacific became the term of the century. And so we are looking at much more. But what is more important are these red dots and green dots and blue dots. They sort of are our oil investments. Apart from that, there are many other investments. So when we look at capabilities and capacity, we should be able to not only address what is within our borders, but also support and protect, if I would say, India's interests abroad, which includes not only investments, but also includes our people abroad, especially Indian citizens. So I just thought I'll give this snapshot here to have a look at how should we look at the world? We have to look inwards as well as outwards. And this is where we need to look at what are the various threats and challenges. That if we are going to look at what is our force modernization, what should be our force structure, there should be a general understanding as to what are the threats and challenges we look at. The first one is obviously traditional. There is no two ways about it. Sovereignty was, and General Puri had mentioned sovereignty issues. If we cease to exist as a nation, any other interest has no meaning whatsoever. So the traditional threat is always the foremost, and that is with state actors whose actions are inimical to our national interests. And obviously, as I always say, we've got a very active western border, and we have a lively eastern border which has become active once again. There's a long time that no shot was fired across that border, but it does happen, not exactly a shot, but then of course tensions are high. So traditional threats is something, and challenges is something which is foremost when you look at force modernization and your force structures. Then of course it is the non-traditional, and this is emanating from land, sea or air. One example I can give you is terrorism. We have it every day across the border. We've had it across the seas for a long time. And I think 2611 is the best example I can give you from the sea. And with the proliferation of small sized drones, air is the next element. And air is as porous as the land border or as the maritime border. So this is a threat that we need to look at, especially when we look at non-traditional. And I especially focus on terrorism because we have been the victims of terrorism since 1947. Then, of course, there's transnational crime. In the maritime area, the first thing that springs to mind is piracy. But across the land and the maritime borders and even air, if we can add it, is drugs, arms, and human trafficking. This is also affecting our country in a big way because it sort of tries to weaken our internal organization and infrastructure. And the armed forces also have a role to play when it comes to protecting your internal issues. And that is what we call when we head aid to civil authorities in some sort of form or the other. Another big issue is climate change and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, both within India and outside India, because if we don't lend a helping hand outside, we are looked upon as a regional player. We're a big growing sort of power in the Indo-Pacific. We are the preferred security partner. We are also the first responder insofar as HADR goes. So therefore, climate change is a big issue that needs to be looked at. So the assets which you take or we tend to procure, some are going to be hard security, but there are many which have a dual purpose. And that dual purpose can be spread across all the three armed forces as well as certain civil authorities. One example I can give you is NDRF. Then, of course, the last one, which is gaining more and more traction, is non-evacuation of civilian personnel, NEO, non-evacuation of non-combatant people. We've seen it during the recent COVID pandemic. We've seen it from unstable areas. I can give you the example of Kuwait, when we took out our people from Kuwait across land, across air, across the sea. Not only was the Navy and the Air Force involved in a big way, but also was Air India. So you have your whole national assets that come into play out here, and the armed forces play a significant role. Flexibility is the key. Let's just have a cross look at the maritime domain, since it was mentioned. We got a vast coastline. I'm not going to give you the major factors, but do remember, if we go in for our extended continental shelf, which we have deposited our claim, then the EZ plus 1.2 million square kilometers added to 2.02 is equal to the land mass of India. So you're going to look at two Indias. One is maritime and one is going to be on land. I'm not saying that maritime should be all pervasive, but yes, there is an option that we need to choose about flexibility of our force modernization for meeting all our requirements. And this is where all the three services will get involved in some way or the other. Do remember, we have a lot of island territories to protect and ensure safety of. Then, of course, we have choke points and the international shipping lanes or SLOCs. Do remember that most of our oil imports are from abroad. There was a time from where we used to get mainly from the Persian Gulf, but now we have diversified to as far as South America. So SLOCs. And if we are going to be dependent on oil from abroad, then we need to ensure our energy supply lines are kept in check. Issue of ISR was covered by General. And so in the Indian Ocean region, annually we'll have 120,000 ships, plus more smaller fishing vessels, trawlers, some ships who do not have what is called an automatic identification system. So identification surveillance becomes an issue. And this is where domain awareness takes #1 priority insofar as intelligence and being prepared is concerned. A little bit more on that towards the end. Malacca Strait has got 70,000 ships coming through. In fact, in the Indian Ocean region, these are standard figures of 33% of the world's bulk cargo, 66% of oil, 50% of container shipments come across. So therefore, there is presence of extra regional paths, which adds to our calculations when we look at our operations and also our force requirements. India, fortunately, has a fulcrum position. So we have sort of an equal reach on all sides. So therefore, we need to have those assets in place that can get the right people there at the right time, whether it's by air, land, or by sea. But the fastest means is required. International law. We are a big supporter of international law insofar as the maritime domain is concerned. UNCLOS springs to mind. So therefore, we have to be very careful and cautious the methodology we use in selecting our force assets and also mainly the deployment. And then, of course, overseas investments is what I had covered earlier, which is important also. So let's have a look at some maritime focus areas. So insofar as maritime is concerned, there's a need to look at traditional and non-traditional threats, and therefore that is where the dual purpose nature of assets comes about. And one example I can give you is one big lesson after tsunami 2004 was that whenever ships sail out, they carry what is called a brick for looking after any HADR requirement that comes up. So the ship is already at sea, and there have been instances in the past where there has been a disaster, the nation has asked for help, and the ships have just been diverted and sent to that area because they were carrying the right equipment. So this is a mix and match of how to look at traditional, non-traditional threats. And the Navy is now looking at mission-based deployments, which actually caters for a plethora of requirements, whether it's evacuation of civilians, disaster relief, or maybe even contending with traditional threats. So therefore, the second focus area has already been covered is safety, security of our seaborne trade and energy routes, especially in the IOR. If we cannot protect our SLOCs, then obviously there is something wrong. And this is not only where the Navy comes in. The air and the land element can also be used, but we need to work out, as the General said, is we need to look at certain doctrines of ours. Maybe we need a revisit to look at the jointness aspect. How do we push this through? Then, of course, maintaining freedom of navigation, strengthening international legal regime at sea, particularly UNCLOS. But more importantly, is cooperation and coordination to counter common threats at sea. Now, this is something that is not only with our neighbors, but also within the three services. Because as in the NMF, we say 2 armies, 2 navies, 2 air forces don't go to war. It is 2 nations who go to war. So therefore, we need to bring the full weight of our military capability and power component in case it's a traditional threat. But if it is a non-traditional threat, then we need to act in the same way. What are the driving factors? So let's see. The first of all, if you're looking at force modernization and a force structure, the requirement is to first of all deter conflict. And the biggest deterrence we have is our conventional power. The nuclear angle I will not discuss because that's a separate angle to itself. And the second is to deter coercion against India, that we should be able to stand up. And I think what our actions against China is an example, a perfect example of this. Then, of course, to conduct military operations in a manner, if the deterrence factor fails, that enable early termination of conflict on terms favorable to India. These 2 aspects are totally looking at hard power issues. But then, of course, let's get back into little soft power issues to shape a favorable and positive environment to enhance stability and security in India's areas of interest. This could be along the borders insofar as our own borders are concerned, and also in a international arena. Do remember, the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force have always been present for the maximum number of UN operations. We have a long history there. So this also goes into that favor. The other is to protect Indian assets against strikes and threats emanating from land, sea, air, and space. This is essentially on the non-traditional side, and the main focus here is on terrorism. Space is a new issue we need to look at, because sooner or later, the space issue is going to come out big, and that has already been covered. So what is the aim? The aim, if you look at your force prioritization and modernization, is to develop requisite force levels and maintain the capability of meeting India's security requirements. What are these security requirements? There's a long list. There is no priority given, and it's also not available in the open domain per se. And the second is joint operations. As I've mentioned, the three services need to act together. And the theater command drive that is taking place may be the right path towards perhaps ensuring joint operations, but that is a road we have to yet travel. So let's look at certain developments. What is the focus? So first is indigenization. Jalpuri covered the issue about defense sector, private sector. We have to look at indigenization. We have to look at self-reliance. We have to look at self-sufficiency. We need to reduce our imports. And I think we've come a long way since independence. There is a lot of indigenous stuff that is coming out. Most of the ships that are being constructed and built are indigenous. The equipment is being indigenously developed. But if you personally ask me, I don't believe in something which is called 100% indigenization. There would be no point in setting up an industry only catering for a certain specific item if you can get it from abroad at a cheaper rate. Why set up a whole infrastructure? So that is a question of guns and butter, a graph, if we can call it, at that issue, but that needs to be looked at. But indigenization is the first step towards a potent force development, especially your own indigenous one. Maritime domain awareness has been covered. I totally agree that we need to do it. And just to share with you here, without going into details, that Indian naval air assets were used in Kargil for the information warfare part of the campaign. Even now, the P-8Is are one of the best aircraft we've got, and they've also been used on land for certain purposes. So this is what I say about cross usage of assets, and of course to see that when you buy a certain asset, how can it be used beyond the required picture. If you're to look at, say, maritime operations, is that we will look at designs of ships that have longer sea legs, therefore they can stay for longer durations at sea. The operation cycles will be longer, extended reach. At any given time, we have got ships which are operating in the wider aspect of the Western Pacific, insofar even up to the Mediterranean. And the day the Prime Minister was giving his talk at the United Nations Security Conference, the one which when India was the president, and we looked at the maritime domain and interoperability, we had ships in 4 or 5 different ports the world over. So that is a sort of a statement that we can make. We can replicate it across the board when we look at land and air assets. We recently had an Indian contingent that went for exercises in with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO. This is one way of looking at it. Insofar as carriers are concerned, I will just give it in 2-3 lines. The mainstay of Indian Navy's operations is sea control, and the best asset for ensuring sea control is an aircraft carrier. So when we wrote the IMSS 2015, we looked at 3 carrier battle groups, which meant that we will look at 2 carrier task forces on 1 or 2 carrier battle groups. A rough calculation will give you 4 to 5 carriers. We can discuss this during question and answers, but I leave it there because there is a requirement that comes from, I'll address it in the last slide. Then, of course, if you need to support these operations, you have to have force maintenance, infrastructure, and logistics in place. And when I speak about infrastructure and especially logistics, it's not only within your near area. If we are operating ships well beyond the Indian Ocean region, then we need to get this going. And I think it's happening. That's why we deploy so far away, and we have presence, and presence is very important. And then, of course, there is always a look at new and evolving technologies. Keep your doors open, let it flow in, let the private sector give you what they have, and and as the military armed forces, we should be able to tell them, this is what we want, will you develop it for us? So there has to be a dialogue. In concluding remarks, the aim is to build and maintain a balanced, multi-dimensional, multi-spectrum, flexible force. Now, these are big words. And this, therefore, I'm looking at all the 3 armed forces: balanced, multi-dimensional, multi-spectrum, flexible, which can cater to both traditional and non-traditional threats. If we can look at dual purpose equipment, that is the best thing to do because it will suit the boat for both these types of threats and for all the three services across it. More importantly, as I said, each armed force of India has a function and an operating philosophy. There are differing requirements. I give you the example of the aircraft carrier, that if I want to have air support at the right time, at the right place, and I'm away from the mainland, only a carrier can give me that. And the example I can give you is China. We speak about the PLA Navy's entry to the Indian Ocean region. Why? The reason why PLA Navy is not operating in strength out there, because it does not have air cover. Any potent force requires an air cover because it gives you not only an extended surveillance bubble, but it also gives you certain reach of your munitions. Also, if you're looking at soft power assets, it gives you the reach to reach out to the people in need. The first question the US president asked in time of crisis is, where is the nearest carrier strike group? There is a reason why the US continues to operate and maintain around 11 and now looking back at 13 carriers. There is a reason. We may look at the ASBM as is often touted, but if that is a Brahmastra, there is always a counter Brahmastra and a counter Brahmastra that will come in time. Carriers have always been a target. The Royal Navy ended the World War II with 54 carriers, out of which only 10 were sunk in action. If that speaks for anything else, I'm just saying that this is a good ratio to look at. And then, of course, common equipment, joint purchase is essential. Things are working out right now, and I'm sure it will only improve. Insofar as priorities and budget allocation is concerned, there's a need to understand the diverse challenges and threats in all mediums, whether it's land, sea, air, or space. And this is where everybody has to keep the thinking, the caps on, be flexible and open it. And also, you need to understand the operating nuances at the strategic and tactical level of all the three armed forces. As I said, if you want to deliver and you want to address your traditional and non-traditional threats, then we need to work together. Thank you so much for your time. And now I'll pause for questions, which I thoroughly enjoy.
Thank you so much, Captain Parmar. That was a very realistic assessment made by you. The same goes for Lieutenant General Ahuja as well. Both the speakers have given such a very important, at the same time, a very realistic assessment. In terms of the, the requirements, in terms of the prioritization so far as our defense modernization and defense preparedness is concerned. Very quickly, we have, we are running against time. So I'll go over to the questions. The first question that I have here is for Captain Parmar. This is regarding piracy threat. This is from, is it Oishi Kundu? Miss Oishi Kundu, am I right? This is regarding the piracy threat.
The question is from Pallavi.
Okay, this is from Pallavi. All right. Sorry. So Pallavi says, with our growing economies reliable on SLOCs, sea lines of communication, and shifting focus of piracy hotbeds towards Gulf of Guinea, do you think we have put enough focus on military cooperation with nations of West Africa or other than Nigeria? On a broader note, in your view, what kind of defense cooperation can India have with small nations like the one in West Africa to secure our interest?
Thank you, Reshmi.
Please. Yeah.
First, I'd like to apologize to General Ahuja. I, by mistake, call you General Puri, sir. Anil Puri is a classmate of mine. So
No, it's perfectly fine. And he's a good friend.
Yes, my apologies for that, sir.
Perfectly fine.
All right. Insofar as the Gulf of Guinea is concerned, I had written something for, I think, Brookings sometime back when we had a chat with the African nations. Why is it that the world is not showing interest in the Gulf of Guinea as compared to the Horn of Africa? For the simple reason is that there is nothing of interest for, or a big ISL that runs down the western coast of Africa. Even off the Horn of Africa, it took some time for the international community to get its act together and start acting. But for us, the Gulf of Guinea is important because if I didn't point it out on the map I showed you in the second slide, but we have oil investments in Nigeria and Gabon. So there is a lot that we can share with these Western Asian or West African countries like Nigeria and Gabon, and to share lessons with them how to counter piracy. There's a difference in the type of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea and Horn of Africa. Horn of Africa was human lives at stake. the pirates understood that you held somebody for ransom, money would be paid. In the Gulf of Guinea, it's not that. The lives have no value. It is the cargo. In fact, there is still a pending case where the Indian master of a ship went missing. He's still missing. And because the pirates just took him out just because he refused to cooperate with them. So that's been a long time back. But we need to look on focusing on the Gulf of Guinea because we have interest there. It is going to impact our national interest. It is time we reached out. Nigeria is doing its own little bit. I'm not sure in what, how much assistance we are giving them. But in my mind, it's not defense cooperation in a way. We can deploy ships there, but yes, but you'll have a limited role because do remember, you'll be operating in somebody else's maritime zones. So there's another issue involved there. But yes, what we can share with them is our experiences and our best practices and definitely assist them in addressing piracy of the Gulf of Guinea. So Pallavi, I hope that answers your question. I'll share the paper with you separately so you can go through it. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next question that I have here, actually it coincides with the question which I also had in mind. So I'm going to club this together. The question is the conflict of interest between the tri-service, which we mentioned. I mean, both these speakers have detailed so very, clearly the importance of coordination and cooperation between the tri-services. But at the same time, we do understand on the more practical side, on the realistic side, there is a conflict of interest between the tri-service, especially on the budget of modernization, sorry. And Oishi, Ms. Oishi Kundu, she also has a similar question out here. The inter-service rivalry appears to be one of those issues that defense affects defense planning in many ways, and it affects the ability to focus on military modernization. How has inter-service rivalry affected force modernization in India till date? And how do you see inter-service rivalry being controlled or managed, in terms of keeping in mind the future requirements? This is for the panel, please. So both the speakers can field it. It's up to them.
Yeah, Reshmi and Oishi, I read your question and you've been more than polite in saying that in other countries we have this. Let me tell you upfront, we have it perhaps more than many other countries. We have it. Now, why do we have it? One, it's a function of the scarcity of resources. When you have limited capital acquisition budgets, everybody fights for the small resources that are available. Number two, there is an ambiguity of defining national defense objectives. If the nation had clearly defined that we want to put our weight for whatever rationale that we both have put across to you in the maritime domain, or we want to put it on the land domain, in the continental domain. If it was given categorically, we would have no ambiguity in our mind. We wouldn't be fighting for the same cake. I would know that Captain Parmar deserves a bigger cake than what I do. Third, is that our system of planning, well, it's ad hoc. We call it defense budgets, but I have always consistently said it's not budgeting for defense. We are just apportioning. Every year we give some to him, some to him, some to him, and we do not have a rationale for giving it. Have I experienced it? Yes, we've experienced it all our lives. And most strikingly, if I put myself not in my last job where it was to reconcile between the three services, but somewhere in between when as part of army, we were trying to get a mountain strike corps. The kind of resistance that we faced, of course, there was a resistance from the policy makers at the national level because they wanted the rationale for getting 90,000 men and so many thousand crores. But the biggest resistance was coming from the Navy and the Air Force to army. And they were more bothered that if army raises the strike core, what's going to happen to our share of the pie? So it's a reality. It's happening because of lack of resources, lack of planning, and lack of clear priorities. And yes, if we sort this out, we can definitely do it a little bit.
Thank you.
Yep.
Lieutenant Ahuja, you are in. Okay, yes, I'm sorry.
I
Yes.
just thought I'll add my 2 bits and add on to what General Ahuja has said. There will always be inter-service rivalry. Let's face the fact. There is rivalry everywhere. There may be rivalry if somebody's asked a good question. Let me ask a better question. Just on a light side of life on that aspect out here. But there are 2 issues here, and General Ahuja has very clearly brought out that priorities. We need to have a national perspective, which is not there. But I think one way of addressing this issue is to ensure that our procurement process gets shortened. The moment you decide on something and time lapse happens, you'll find that equipment is redundant, the prices, costs have gone up. I mean, there are innumerable examples under defense procurement that fall under this. If you are able to ensure a smooth and a shortened procurement process, a lot of these rivalry issues may not exist. So I'll just stop here.
Lieutenant General Ahuja, you are in demand again. So do you think, this is from Suvarna Deshmukh, do you think there is still space for the debate on defense versus development in today's environment as the economy of the world, including, I guess ours, including India, are not doing well due to the pandemic?
See, to a rational person, as you are when you ask this question, I think it's a very, very logical question to ask. Listen, people are dying of COVID. We have health issues. We don't have beds. We don't have oxygen. And you want guns and you want this. But one thing, defense of the nation is paramount, and we unfortunately do not have the luxury to pause this. There is no way that Pakistan or China or anybody else is going to give a pause in the security threats. The second is, it's a rather simplistic solution, and the defense planners shouldn't be paid what they are paid if they took a linear decision, either or decision. Oh, we need it for health, so let's stop defense. In fact, this is exactly what happened last year, March, April, when COVID started. Every ministry's budget was cut, including restrictions were placed on expenditure, including on the budget of Ministry of Defense. But when you looked at what Americans were doing, this was a time when additional budget was pumped into defense industry. And the smart thing for us would be that this is the time when the industry is in dire straits, you have trouble, put in more money, help them to survive. Wherever the supply chains are collapsing, let them get an opportunity to shift it here and make them survive and make them come out stronger out of this opportunity. So in the nation's scheme of things, I think despite what has happened, despite our conflicting priority requirements, we still need to continue spending on defense to maintain continuity, but we need to do it smartly. There are 100 ways, and there are smarter people than me who are available to find this answer.
Captain Parmar, you're on fire. How, this is from Mr. Tanishq Saxena. How are India's military priorities managed in the light of the new threats related to cyber and emerging technologies such as AI, artificial intelligence? In your view, so far, has India placed enough focus on these threats?
That's a good question. We are focusing on these threats. We're a little too late on this platform, but we have recognized them. And there is a lot of work being done as far as AI and ML, machine learning goes. And I have no doubt in my mind that in the years to come, you'll find this finding its right place in defense procurement and the methodology in which we operate. Slightly late, but at least we've woken up to the fact that this sum needs to be looked at. And then, of course, one of my bullets, if you remember, was newer and emerging technology. So we are actually at the mercy of the industry. If the industry is looking at AI ML and it is not something we need, then we need to reach out to the industry and tell them this is exactly what we want, build it up for us. That focus is growing. In fact, when you look at most of the big PSUs or the big companies who have a defense sector or a defense division, they're all looking at this in a big way. So give it time, we'll be there. We can be at it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Captain Parmar, Captain Election General Ahuja. Thank you so much. As a moderator, I'll take the liberty of having the last question from my side, if you allow me. And that is, we have seen in the past that there has been a conflict of interest from the supplier side and end user, like between the bureaucracy and the military, if I can put it that way. So how do you see that in today's context, considering the government has launched, major force restructuring programs? How do you see to strike a balance between the ongoing conflict or the existing conflict between the bureaucracy and the military, so far as the demand and supply is concerned? Any one of you or both of you? It's a pleasure.
After you, sir.
Okay. So first of all, Reshmi, I don't think there is a conflict per se between bureaucracy and military. What happens is we have too many good people, too many sincere people, all wanting to work in their own respective domains. Now, somebody sitting in Defense Finance or Ministry of Finance is looking at optimizing and getting the best value of each rupee. Armed forces have a challenge. They are as nationalist in wanting indigenization, self-development, all indigenously developed weapons by DRDO technology. They want to wait. They are proud Indians. But they have the responsibility of keeping themselves operationally prepared 24/7. The threats are not pausing. So they want it as of yesterday, the capabilities. The DRDO wants time to develop. The finance wants to secure all the money. The bureaucrat wants that we do it in the most optimum manner. Now, somebody says L1 is the best way to do it. Somebody says L1T1 is the best way to do it. Well, they don't want to go on for years getting into these scams and scandals. So what happens is everybody is doing his or her bit, but there is lack of coordination and we have procedural weaknesses to do this, which manifests as a conflict between the two. So the answer to this is that one, let's be clear about our priorities. I mean, you must have heard, your ears would have got tired of listening the requirement of national security strategy, national defense strategy. What I say is don't write it if you don't want to write it. But for God's sake, some of the dilemmas and questions that we have, let's answer them. I had highlighted a few of them when I spoke. And let's get our procedures streamlined and let's bring a method into the madness of our budget allocation for defense. And that is the answer. The day this procedure gets streamlined, the perceived fight between bureaucracy and military will vanish on its own.
I hope so too.
I hope so.
What are your views?
All right, I'll just quote one law of economics, which says the cost of what you want is the cost of what you give up to get what you want.
Wonderful.
If that is understood, then I think the solution lies there. It's a priority, automatically will come out from that. I'll pause here. Thank you, Reshmi.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant General Ahuja, Captain Parmar, for this, very interesting session made possible by both your inputs, and I'm sure all the participants, your questions, it has further contributed to this enriched and lively session that we've had. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Pallavi. Thank you, Shreya, for making this happen. And thank you for having me here too. Over to you, Pallavi.
Thank you, Dr. Reshmi. So, wonderful discussion. I know there are a few questions still pending in the chat, and I know we all have a lot more questions. I do, but in interest of time, I'm going to restrict myself. So, thank you, General Ahuja, Captain Parmar, and Dr. Kazi for joining us today and having such an engaging and interesting discussion. And we look forward to welcoming everyone next week on the session on economics and geopolitics of India's procurement aspect. So we're going from priorities to procurement, and the next session after that is going to be on production. So see you all next week. Take care. Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.